Okay, we are back and we are recapping our last session, which was on racial reconciliation, our last Tough Topics conversation. It was with Dr. Michael and Reverend Jonathan Reynolds, who are a father and son duo that you know a little bit from your time at Trinity, and we spent some time with them talking about the topic of race and racial reconciliation.
Yeah, so the conversation went long. It was an hour and a half, so we're going to have it kind of time spliced so that you can go to the question and kind of follow through. Just follow whatever questions you want to just get a quick snippet of there. But really good conversation, awesome conversation. They have really good insights. Dr. Reynolds was my professor at Trinity, and he teaches a lot on racial reconciliation. And it was a fantastic conversation that we really appreciated. So check it out and make sure you watch that. One of the things that we want to touch on in this video is, first of all, why we talk about this in general. Why do we talk about racial reconciliation? And there's kind of two different lenses that we think about this in, and one is the personal lens, and the other is the like social lens and community lens. So in the personal lens, we think it is a really important part of our sanctification. Everything that kind of comes up that is not in line with how Christ would have us live, we should examine. And if we do have any prejudice or any bias towards a people group simply because of their race, that's a problem, and that's something that we should be working through to submit our thoughts to more like Christ and be more like Christ. We don't think there is going to be racial divisions in heaven, so we should be striving for that in our personal lives, to be aware of these things, even if this conversation is extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it really comes back, as so many things do for us, comes back to our theology of the gospel and our theology of the kingdom. And basically the idea, and part of our vision statement, is that we're a kingdom-bringing church, and the idea there is basically, if it's going to be in heaven, we're supposed to pursue it now. If it's not going to be in heaven, we are supposed to pursue the end of it now. So, and justice conversations fit into that. So, I mean, there are some people who are uncomfortable with certain conversations that we have around justice, and why are we talking about this, or whatever, and really that's what it comes back to, is because we believe we're supposed to be pursuing what Jesus is bringing in its fullness in the kingdom, and that is there won't be racism, there won't be injustice, there won't be other things too, human trafficking, abortion, all of these things that we see in our world, we shouldn't be okay with. And so that, in that sense, whether or not you want to call it a gospel issue and say, shouldn't we be focusing on the gospel in this way, that's sort of another conversation. But we do think it's definitely important and definitely worth talking about, and we'll continue to at our church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it kind of comes in the same vein as the old missions conversation of, do you just preach the gospel or do you provide for people's needs?
Right.
And in this context, it's, do we just preach the gospel or do we address social justice issues? Mm-hmm. Which that's a buzzword, and I probably shouldn't be using it, but just like justice issues in our community.
Right.
And from our perspective, it's confusing to us, because why can't we do both? Of course we preach the gospel. If you've been here for any amount of time at our church, we talk about salvation and how sinners are saved through the good news of Jesus. But a part of that good news of Jesus is him bringing the kingdom. And a part of that is that the church should be working in our cultural context, in our communities, to bring the kingdom of God and to, as John said, remove and eliminate any aspects that will not be in the kingdom of God in the new creation.
Right, and a popular pushback to conversations around race is the idea that we shouldn't be talking about this, that the answer to this is the gospel and preaching the gospel. But for us, what we try to do is we try to apply that kingdom theology and that lens of justice consistently. So there's people who don't want to talk about race generally are okay with talking about something else, be it abortion, being it human trafficking, whatever. Race is a conversation that makes us uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable to talk about it. We're put in uncomfortable situations when we talk about it. It's maybe a little uncomfortable for us to invite, like a black person to come and speak and preach at our church, which is 99% white, right? Might be a little uncomfortable for them as well. But we still think that that's important. Mm-hmm. They still think it's important, so they still come and do it. And there is some discomfort around it, but and even Dr. Reynolds even talked about this idea that we should be willing to push through that discomfort and push through some, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to fail, we're going to say the wrong term, some of that stuff. That stuff's not that important. What's important is the heart behind why are we pursuing this at all, and that we want to do our small part to be a part of bringing racial reconciliation, which is something that we believe that Christians are called to. And we know we're never going to be a church that is leading. We're on the forefront of these conversations, but it's good for us to occasionally talk about it. Certainly, to occasionally have someone who's not white in to speak. Those are great things, right? Mm-hmm. And the nature of it is in our context. We talked about this a little bit in the women in ministry discussion as well. The only way for us to consistently have any sort of presence that isn't white guys is to prioritize it, because that's what we're going to find in our context. I have nothing against white guys, as you can probably tell, right? But it's good to get other people into those conversations, and we have to prioritize that if it's going to happen. Otherwise, it just won't.
Yeah, so that's why we invite speakers that have different perspectives than we do, and why we constantly put these topics in front of us. Because if we don't intentionally do that, we just won't think about it. And especially in our social context here, it can be very easy for us to just avoid it entirely. Mm-hmm. And then when things come up in the media or in the national view, then we form all of these stereotypes, and all of these prejudices begin to form within our own thinking without actually having a person or an individual to contact and to get their perspective, or to hear from them, or to see them. Seeing somebody on a screen is so much different than even seeing somebody in person speak to you, mm-hmm. and having the opportunity after service to shake their hand. So we think this is really important for us to consistently be hearing from people with different perspectives as a way for us to grow in our faith. And hearing their stories, like hearing the things that Dr. Reynolds told John when he was a kid growing up, like those are things my dad didn't tell me, right? Because mm-hmm. he never had to.
Right.
Hearing their stories of the things that they've experienced, it really does help us to at least frame what we would view as like a national debate or conversation in personal terms. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversations we have are around the idea of reconciliation and around relationship, of race relations. Mm-hmm. We're not even trying to come up with like systematic solutions for problems. That's not at all any of the conversations we have. It's really about, in the church and in our context, and where we do have a little bit more of a say, what are we doing to try to be a part of bringing reconciliation to the relationships between people of different racial groups that have over the history of our country have not been in good relational places, and how can we be a part of reconciling those things? So, if whatever you think about, some of the more loaded terms, which we don't think are especially helpful, be it it's systemic racism, white privilege, a lot of these terms that can make people go to a certain place in their mind, and we don't even all share the same definitions of those things. What we can say 100%, and it's not even difficult to say, is that we are not living in a post-racial society where race relations are a non-issue or a non-factor. We're not living in a place where people don't see color. We're not living in a place where the best way for us to move forward is just to not talk about it anymore. Mm-hmm. It's just there's no way to look at what's going on in the world and say that's where we're at as a society. So it's based on that we say, hey, let's talk about this, and let's hear from people with different perspectives. Not to say that we want everyone to hold one view of how to proceed with this politically or systematically, anything like that. That's not even our goal. That's not even our point. Our point is there is still a divide. There is still a relational divide, and there is still a need for reconciliation. And what can we do to be a part of that in our context? What are some small things we can do as a church? And again, we talk about it. We let other people who have different perspectives talk about it, and we listen and we try to learn.
And I think that's part of the discomfort for a lot of us. Like for me, I'm a white guy, and I keep hearing all of these inflammatory messages insinuating that perhaps I'm a racist.
Right.
some of the ways that people talk about this kind of insinuates that there's a racist under every rock, and everybody's a racist, and we immediately shut the conversation down and walk away from it. And the reason why we keep talking about it is that we think it is important for us to examine ourselves. Nobody's calling you a racist. I got to step back and say nobody's calling me a racist, but do I have some prejudice? Perhaps. And that's something that I should think through. It's something that I should work on in my personal life to make sure that I don't have those as a part of just my general sanctification. And I think a lot of this language, it just gets so inflammatory when it comes to solutions then for systematic racism when we hear that term thrown around. And that's where the political debate really gets heated up, and we disagree on solutions of systematic racism, but we can all agree that racism does exist in our culture, and it has historically been worse. And what does that do for our society today? So it shouldn't be a conversation of whether or not this exists. The conversation is around what should we do now? But because of the inflammatory language, oftentimes it forces us to get so uncomfortable and draw back to the point that we're arguing whether it even exists or not.
Yeah, and a lot of that is, again, it's a political identity, or it's a different identity, that gets prioritized over just our Christianity and what we're supposed to do with biblical truth in terms of how we treat human beings. Pastors right now who speak out about racism a lot, they're guys like us. A lot of them went to very conservative seminaries. And they get, labeled as Marxists, because they're talking about it and saying hey guys, maybe we need to look at this. Maybe we need to do something a little bit differently. And then there's the other extreme too, where people get so lost in kind of progressive ideals that we've talked about before, being what we describe as the kingdom without the king. So we want equality, we want this, we want that, but we've taken God out of it completely is kind of the progressive ideal, and we can get lost in the noise of those conversations so much, but be more important than any of that stuff, and what we're trying to prioritize above that stuff is simply how do we teach the people in our congregation to examine their own hearts. And that's been a theme of all of these conversations. It's not just a race thing. Are we actually able? Do we have enough inner life? Do we have enough emotional health? Do we have enough self-awareness to actually look at our own lives and say, okay, what do I feel? How do I think about this? And can I actually take stock of my own motives? Can I actually take stock of the things that affect me? Or am I simply a product of everything that I'm inundated with, and I can't actually get past that, So cultivating an inner life where we can actually get to the point where we can look at ourselves and say, maybe I do have some prejudice, and I don't want to have that, and I don't need to go online and say I'm a racist and I repent and now I'm an anti-racist or any of that stuff. That stuff's not that helpful. It really isn't. But what can be helpful is making small changes in our own hearts, making small changes in the way that we treat people and the way that we listen to people, and that's what we want this conversation to be about at our church, to a large degree.
And seeking out, I think Lindholm talked about it, seeking out to listen to understand. So often when we hear these conversations, they're not in personal relationships. We listen to formulate our rebuttal, especially when we're listening to things online or videos that we see online, instead of listening to people's stories just to understand. I think that and the going into relational failure that John talked about before, I think those two ideas will be really powerful and really help us in this conversation and really go a long way. And then recognizing how we're thinking about the issue in terms of what we should do systematically, personally, socially. We may disagree on a lot of those things, and that's okay. But don't just extrapolating it and making it this using inflammatory language just to get somebody to do what you want them to do. For example, if you want somebody to post something or say something about this online, saying things like, "If you're silent on this, then you're contributing to the problem."
Yeah.
Not really, right?
Not really.
there's a lot of this inflammatory language that is just not helpful. So
Right.
the point is, like, let's think through this with clarity, and love each other and get into relationships and hear from people who have different perspectives and experiences.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in other sessions too, but it's okay to not have a take.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to just to try to learn a little bit, or to listen, or to, whatever, to take a break from it, all of those things. But yeah.
So yeah, we posted another video on this as well, and on this topic after the George Floyd incident. So you can check that out too. If you have questions on this further, always reach out to us. There's a few good resources that we can point you towards. First and foremost, Justin Giboney from the AND campaign. They talk, I think, really well about this in terms of the social, political landscape and how we should be discussing racial reconciliation on that front.
For sure. Another one, the Holy Post podcast. I think they've done a good job with this topic over recent weeks. Phil Vischer put out a video that went viral about just race and that topic, and that's a pretty good watch too. I think there's some stuff in there that some people think is controversial, but overall I think it's just good information and certainly just a good learning experience too. So those are some good resources to take a look at. We definitely encourage you guys to do that. I know this conversation has been, people have been inundated with it over recent weeks. But now that things are starting to quiet down, I think it is important for us as a church to continue to move it forward in the small ways that we do. And we thank you for listening to this and for engaging with it.